So finals are coming up for my master's program, and as I was doing some studying for the exam, I looked through my textbook and found this chapter that I'm going over currently called Managing Individuals in a Diverse Workforce. And I looked at this picture and couldn't help but notice a similarity to some of the pictures that I remembered from when I was a kid in like elementary and high school. So if you guys remember, there was always in those like Spanish textbooks and stuff, there would always be examples of like kids our age during that time, and it was a completely diverse group of individuals, of men and women, of different cultures and races and backgrounds. They had people that were disabled. Sometimes they would even have a dog. But these pictures reminded me of looking at this textbook, and I was like, hey, I remember this back when I was like a kid, but why does it feel forced now, and yet back then it was just natural? And I feel like that also transferred over to the comic books that I read as well. I had diverse characters in everything that I read, considering whether it was like different cultures or races or even aliens, like different alien species. If you look at the Green Lantern Corps, you could go on for hours about all the different alien species that they had. Or more specifically, and probably one of the best examples of this, is X-Men or Giant Size X-Men issue number 1. Like, let's go ahead and just take a look at this. And if you guys look at all these iconic comic book characters, all of them had a specific diverse trait that made them who they are. I mean, let's look at Storm, who is a black female who later leads the X-Men into plenty of different missions and victories. We have Wolverine, a short Canadian man. We have Colossus, who is a Russian man. We have Thunderbird, who's a Native American man. We have Banshee, who is an Irish man. We have Nightcrawler, who is a German man. And Sunfire, who's a Japanese man. Like, could we get any more diverse with this group of characters? I don't ever remember looking at this and saying, man, I hate the fact that they have all these, look at all this diversity, equity, and inclusion. Ugh, get it out of my comic book. But the reason why this worked is because each one of these characters, the reasons why people love them so much is because each one of their backgrounds made them specifically who they are and who they were. And I think that says a lot about the writer. This is another great iconic page of the new team, kind of coming together. A lot of people would look at this now, or a lot of people would look at comics now and say, oh, well, it feels like they're just checking boxes, right? It feels like, oh, well, we have to have a strong black female character, so that's in there just because, just for reasons. And that is extremely, honestly, a poor way of looking at diversity and equality within comic books. And because if you're just checking those boxes just to get diversity in the story, it actually means nothing for the character, and you're actually doing the character a disservice. And so it's unfortunate to see that. You would have to be pretty shallow to think that to put in your comic book, I'm just going to throw in a diverse character just because society tells me to. You would have to be, it's almost patronizing to those communities, to those minority groups, to not have a cultural reason for why these characters were introduced or why they are so beloved. So I hate the fact that people have been trying to push this myth of comics were never diverse. They never accepted anyone of different colors or different, identities or sexes or whatever. And that's just not true when you look at actual comics and you read actual comics. Now, yes, there are individuals, and I always have to preface this in every one of my videos, because if you look at the exception and not the rule, there are always people that are the exception that hated these old comic books because they didn't like to see female characters in their books or whatnot. And that's the exception. But the rule is that most writers and most individuals that were doing these comics were doing it better in the 80s and 90s than they are now. Even as us, as a progressive community, have actually regressed. Because those characters back then in the 80s and 90s were actually written well. They weren't written as stereotypes or caricatures of different racial prejudices. Like, It is so pandering to think that writers are writing a stereotypical gay man in a book and not writing him with any depth. One of the things that I continually heard within my time in the Marine Corps is that the different individuals that kind of came into service all kind of came of their own volition. They were all diverse groups of different backgrounds of all over the world that came to the Marine Corps to serve their country. And I thought that that was something that was really special, that diversity just happened naturally, genuinely, and authentically. It was a beautiful way for us to get to know each other and understand each other's cultural differences or whatnot. And it was because of the organization that brought that together without having to push any type of DEI, or social, economic, or political agenda. And one of the things that I continually heard from all these different minority groups within the Marine Corps was that they just wanted to be treated equally. If true equality is going to exist among people of all different races and cultures, that all they wanted was to be treated equally. Now, why is it, though, that now, as a progressive nation in 2022, equality does not mean the same thing as diversity, and how different they tend to be? Let's look at anyone who has gotten involved with comics within the past 10 years. If they have been hired for diversity's sake, and someone calls them a diversity hire, why is that individual in the wrong? Because if you look at the multiple different, let's take T. Franklin or Vida Allah, for instance, they will claim that most of their books are to bring attention to diversity and inclusion and equity and all these different, political things, and that's fine. But as they're doing that, if someone were to tell them, well, you are hired for your diversity, you were hired to write diverse comics, and because you have a different skin color. If someone were to tell them that, they would then get upset and call you a bigot and a racist, but then they will go into an interview saying the exact same thing, but in a different way. So what's the difference between when I call someone a diversity hire and then when someone else tells themselves that they are in fact a diversity hire? Or you can look at that new trailer that just came out about the black pilot, and he's speaking to two individuals, and I believe the quote is something like, "It must be hard being," and then he interjects really quick and says, "What, a naval aviator?"
It must be hard being a naval aviator.
It would be the exact same thing if you asked one of those comic book writers the same exact question. Like if I'm in an interview with Vida Allah and I say, it must be difficult being a woman of color in comics, but she would cut me off and go, "What, a Marvel Comics writer?" And it's like, no. The whole reason that you pursue your identity as this thing is not as a comic book writer, because when your ideals take over what it is that you are writing about, when writing becomes secondary to your actual job performance and your actual purpose, then what, you aren't a Marvel comic book writer at that point. And that's pretty much my point here, is that when you call someone out for being a diversity hire and not treating them as an equal within the comic book community, they will get all up in arms and say, "I am not a diversity hire. I am more than that. I got here blah blah on my talent." And okay, that's fine. But then the second they get interviewed, what's the first thing they say? "I'm just happy that little girls can see themselves in this project," or "I am so happy that I'm the first black female to ever do this," or "I'm the first trans person to do this." And that's the first thing they always say. So if that is your purpose, if that is what your job is if that's what you were hired there because they were trying to hire a diversity quota, then you have no recourse to respond with, "Oh, well, I'm not anything other than a diversity hire," because that is essentially what that is. And I know just by me saying these things, I will be called all types of names like racist and bigot and sexist, and that's just the nature of what this is. But what I'm trying to get across as well is that with the individuals that I have worked with that have been parts of minority groups, none of them ever wanted to be called a diversity hire, And they actually showed that in their actions and in their words as well. They wanted to be treated equal. They wanted to be on level playing ground. And if they ever were to think that they were hired based off of their skin color, they would be appalled, because true equality would mean that all of this stuff would just be normalized. It wouldn't matter what your skin color is or what your gender is or what your background is. You would be hired off of merit. And if you were a black individual who was writing, then great. Then you can tell whatever story you want, and I'm sure it's going to be good because you were hired based off of your capabilities and your skill on writing. What I think is also really interesting is the fact that a lot of these comic book writers, editors, publishers, creators, what have you, will say that their diverse voices aren't being heard enough, or that there needs to be more, even more diversity within these spaces. When in all actuality, if you look at multiple different sources, like for instance, Bounding into Comics. This was an older article, but I still remember it to this day when I read this tweet. It says, DC Comics writer Vita Ayala exposes her bigotry, says no cis dudes should apply for associate editor or position at Marvel. So that type of behavior is welcomed and accepted over at Marvel. But the second we say, hey, you probably shouldn't hire based solely off of diversity, that's when there seems to be a suspect kind of difference there. And as far as diverse voices not being heard, if you go onto Bleeding Cool, almost every other article is about some sort of creator or writer. Specifically, this one talks about T. Franklin and her Into the Edge of Spider-Verse comic book issue, and how that was so transformative and how it's a good thing. At the end of the day, and I know I continually have to say this in all my videos, I have nothing wrong with diversity and inclusion in the comic book medium. But as long as it is genuine and authentic, that is when we get the best characters and the best stories possibly written and told through these different creators. And at this point in time, we're just not seeing that. And yeah, I hope at some point in time that we can all come together and recognize that equality does not look like this. It doesn't look like different individuals in the comic book community telling cis white men that they can't apply for a job because they need more diversity within a culture. You also need diversity of thought, diversity of religion, of opinion, of cultures, and you can't do that if you are literally excluding people from that. I do think it's funny how this whole video pretty much just got brought up because of one picture in a textbook that I was like, I remember that from like my elementary school days, and I'm sure you guys remember those pictures too. They were all over the place. So what do you guys think? Tell me what comics that y'all have read back in the day, or any comics that you remember that had this level of equality, this level of diversity within it, that was just totally normalized, that no one made a big deal out of it and people loved it. Let me know in the comment section below. I'd love to hear your different comic book recommendations. And also, what do you think about this whole thing? Do you think diversity has gone off the deep end and we've completely missed the whole point of what equality actually means? Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video.